Hi, and welcome to Think Globally, Act Locally in AL. Hey, I'm Eric, and earlier today I was reviewing some code, and there were some strange bugs, and it got me thinking again of the very old and never-ending discussion of when to use local variables and when to use global variables. And I know it's a topic that I have touched in a lot of videos. Hopefully you've seen some of them if you're a subscriber. If not, you know what to hit. Please subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, and you get notified whenever new videos come along. Back to the topic. And there's some patterns that I've seen that indicates to me that there's still a lot of people out there who uses global where they're really not needed. If we go way back in time, the old Navision character-based only had global variables, and you can see the fallout from that. You can actually still see somewhere in PC today. Some of the code units, actually let me show you. Here is my Visual Studio Code. If I go in and I open the base application, I find code units, and I find code unit 12. This is the refactored version. At some point, Microsoft refactored code unit 12. Still, still a bunch of global variables here. If we grab another one, let's do 22. Again, the same thing, tons of global variables. And if we take one like a temporary split journal line here, and let's see where that is used. Let me make this as big as we can. Then we can see that this variable is used in a few places. That's one place. That's, and let's see, here's a bunch of other places where it's used. So like not really necessarily connected, but we don't know. It takes a lot of effort to figure out where this variable, what is the what is connection, how is this stuff related to each other. One of the pattern that I have seen a lot with this, no, just to finish that, sorry, I'm goofing around here. So the fact that everything was global in the character base, and suddenly we got local variables, but the first version of financials was actually written in the character based version and then converted, so it was all written with globals. So we have inherited a lot of globals, even though what I'm talking about is 26 years ago. There's a long-lasting impact of something here, something like this. But around that time in the company I worked at, we tried to create some, some guidelines, some rules, and one of the rules was do not use global variables. And as it is with any other guideline, of course, there are scenarios where you have to use a global variable, but by default, you should almost never use it. And one of the patterns that I see where people are still using it is, in this case, we have a page, and I just created a very, very simple list page of customers. And let's say that I want to add something that I need to calculate. Not a calc field, but something where I need some code to do this. We call it test. And then the pattern I have seen a lot goes something like this. We have a global variable called we'll call it global text. That's a good name, right? So we'll put that in here in the field. We'll add a caption because we're not savages. Global text, and put an application area to it also. And then we will go to the trigger with G's next to each other, the on after get rec, and here we will give global text. We'll do something where global text ends up with a value. Let's do something like format random, something like this. This should give us a string. So let's run it, see how it goes. And we have the new column with the values that are created on after get, and depending on when stuff are actually get, if I press F5, you can see I get new numbers. It's calculated. It works fine. From a lot of viewpoints, this is fine. What I'm saying is that this one do not need to be a global. The problem here becomes if we do something else and we then have a side effect impact on this variable. So a non-global solution to this one would be that instead of this being a global, you make this a function call. So we get rid of this. We get rid of the trigger. Actually, we can just go and do, say, procedure, global text. Maybe it's a local procedure because it will only work within the page itself. Global text, and this one needs to return a text. So we exit the format. So the calculation code, wow, that's pretty. The calculation code, in this case, the format of the random is still the same. So we haven't really changed the business logic. The only thing we have changed is the way that we are mapping this function in. Let's see if we get the exact same result or not. Well, we get a different result because it's different numbers, but we get this. We get our column again, doing the same thing. So now we eliminated. We eliminated the global variable we added. So this is better. But let's say that what we actually want to do here was take the rec.name plus space plus our number here. That would be, let's try and run that and see what we get. Well, we get exactly what we anticipated. We get the customer name with a number at the end, which is fine. But what we actually, the next thing we did here is that now this function here is dependent on a global state, meaning that we believe the rec.name should have a value when we call this. So instead of this being encapsulated and a function that you can predict what it's doing, then this function is now dependent on an external record that is not part of the signature. So what I usually do here in this case is actually that I will pass rec as a parameter up here, and then I would add a variable down here, and then I will do customer.name here. Let's run this again just to make sure that everything is still the same, and it is. We get new numbers when we press F5. So why is this different, you might ask, from the one we just had? Because it's basically doing the exact same thing. But the difference is that this function is now completely encapsulated. So the only thing that this function is using is parameters given, and the only thing it does is it's doing is returning value. The fancy computer science definition of what we have achieved here is called functional programming, meaning that there is no side effect. There is only, you put parameters in, you get values back. Which is great, because now this function could be exposed to have other, if this was a very, very clever function that did some awesome stuff, maybe you wanted to use it somewhere else and you just want to pass the customer in and then you get the value back in reports and whatever it is, and now you can, because you're no longer dependent on a global state. I use the exact same approach when it comes to code units. So the only time I put I put globals into code units are if the code unit is a single instance. So I want to preserve that instance. Typically I do that to, let me give you an example here. Actually, let me go and get BC script, my little compiler thingy, and I'm working on something fancy where you write web pages in AL. Let me know if you're ready for that video. I think it'll come on soon. Anyway, I have here is a code unit, and this code unit is a single instance. And the reason that is single instance is because it's actually subscribing to an event, and I want this code unit to know stuff that is not part of the event signature. I want this to know about certain session states. So to preserve that in the best way, I created it as a single instance, and because BC is not multi-threaded, so this works great, and then I can preserve the global variable I have down here that holds some query string parameters. That was a sidetrack, but the main message here, and in reality it's not a complicated message, is that when you create something like this, if this one has no side effects, you can use it as long as you fulfill the interface. The contract of this one needs a customer record, then you're good. You can use it with no hesitation. It also means that this one is way easier to test, because you don't have to set up a whole lot of environment stuff like that. You need to call the function with a parameter, and then you need to verify the result. In this case, we're doing some random stuff, so random is pretty hard to test. You can test it, but it's more complicated. So that was one of the things I saw today. The other one was, and actually let's just continue on this one. So as I was saying, that if we have a procedure, procedure, I'll call this one test2, and then I will pass a customer here, but I will pass this as var. So by reference. What does that mean? That means that if we from this function do test2 with our customer record, we can manipulate this one and we can do something customer.name equal Eric here, which, let's see what happens. See what happens. See how big of an impact that has. It has the impact that suddenly in our global text function, we changed the name. We actually, this value was pulled out of the record before we get to our column. The problem with this, let me show you, because this is fine if that's the intended purpose. But let's say that instead of, let's create another function. And in this case, we have a sales header. We have a sales line. And we do something, you know, in here we have a repeat test4 sales line and then until true. We'll never call this code because then we're, so what I'm trying to extend in that in test4 we have the sales line var transferred, sales line. Let's see if we can get this up. And in here we do something like sales line document type equal document type invoice on 2 colons, and we insert and we do stuff and we delete or modify and all that good. The problem here is that because this is var transferred, that let's say we have something that if 4 is bigger than 6, then do sales line quantity, and we should validate, but you get my point, is something, but that only if a certain criteria is fulfilled. So maybe the first time we hit this one is actually triggered. But the second time we get into this loop, this one is not triggered, but because we added this value to the sales line var transferred, so the second line will also get a 10, even though this one is not fulfilled, because it was put back into the loop out here and then was passed on to the next ones. So we have the concept of a pseudo global, and in other languages you talk a lot about scope, meaning that you define in what scope a variable lives, and some languages you can have multiple scopes within a single procedure. So we could, if we could do something in AL, then we could have some variables that lived in this scope, but then we could do begin and then other variables would live in that scope. That's not a Pascal thing. Pascal only have those 3 levels in my mind. They have the globals, the locals, and then the var transfer that might live in multiple scopes. And one of the things I saw today was exactly this, that you had in reality a variable that you only used here. So the sales line is only used here, but for some reason it was living up here also, and then it got carried around in the loop. So basically correct scoping you could translate correct scoping to the minimal scoping you need. You should never assign a variable to have a scope that is larger than what you need. Going back to the example from what was we were looking at, code unit 22, I think it was, and I literally just took a random what was it, temp split item journal that is used 42 times in not all of them are, there's an old one, but they're certainly used in multiple places, and this might be right, this might be wrong, but it's really hard to figure out what is the scope of a variable, and for people to debug and to figure out, where if we go back to something, there's no question what is the scope, because a function like this only has the scope. So anyway, there are certainly places where you need global variables. Data sets for reports is an often used scenario where you would need it. You would need it if it has the purpose of keeping something in memory over multiple triggers, keeping something in memory from one event to another event and stuff like that. But in general, you should feel just a tiny bit dirty every time you create a global variable, because you probably in lots of cases don't need it. And also really be careful about the wire transfer, because that can introduce some very funky errors if you're not careful. A comment, and this video is already getting too long. A comment that I have gotten a few times, that a urban myth is that, but if I create a lot of variables, my code will be slower. That is not the case. The amount of variables doesn't really matter. The vast amount of memory your computer has is where that a function call, if it needs to allocate 10 bytes or 2 kilobytes on the stack in a function call, it doesn't matter. For what we're doing, it doesn't matter here. So if you are writing a ray tracer, maybe we should write a ray tracer in AL at some point. Let me know in the comments below if we should write a ray tracer in AL. But if you were writing something that, deep statistical functions where you're calling procedures billion times, and it really, the inner loop of something has to be as fast as possible. Well, you wouldn't do it in AL anyway, but if you did it in AL, it might have an impact on a billion calls impact scale. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. So with this in my mind, make sure that you actually create readable code, understandable code. And one way to make code hard to understand is to use global variables. So you never know what is the state of them unless you're the one who have written the code, or you spend a lot of time reading the code. And I guess that's the end of my global versus local rant. So from now on, I'll always use this video to refer to if people are asking about global versus local. Let me know in the comments below for good cases for globals. Let me just put them in comments and I'll see if I can shoot them down. And if not, you'll get the thumbs up on your comment. So until next time, have a wonderful day.